The morning sun barely peeked through the dusty windows of the old training facility when Marcus, Jake, and David arrived for their first day. The building looked like it had seen better days, paint peeling from the walls, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, and the distinct smell of industrial cleaner mixed with something they couldn't quite identify. Marcus adjusted his new work boots and glanced at his two companions. Jake was fidgeting with his phone, probably texting his girlfriend one last time before they had to surrender their devices. David stood quietly, his military background evident in his straight posture and alert eyes. The three of them had met during the application process, bonding over their shared nervousness about landing this coveted position at Morrison Industries.
"Welcome to hell, gentlemen."
The voice came from behind them, sharp and authoritative. They turned to see a woman in her early 40s striding toward them. She wore simple black pants, a white button-down shirt, and boots that had clearly seen plenty of use. Her dark hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and her eyes held an intensity that made all three men straighten instinctively. "I'm Sarah Chen, your training supervisor for the next 6 months.
You can call me Chen. Not Sarah, not Miss Chen, and definitely not ma'am. Just Chen."
She stopped in front of them, hands clasped behind her back.
"Before we begin, let me make something crystal clear. This isn't your typical corporate training program.
You won't be sitting in conference rooms watching PowerPoint presentations about company values and team-building exercises." Marcus felt his palms getting sweaty. This wasn't what he had expected when he applied for the industrial safety position. The job posting had mentioned hands-on training, but Chen's demeanor suggested something far more intensive.
"Morrison Industries has one of the best safety records in the industry," Chen continued, beginning to pace in front of them. "That record exists because our people know what they're doing.
They know how to think under pressure, how to make split-second decisions that could save lives, and how to work as a team when everything goes wrong.
By the time I'm done with you, you'll either be ready to join that team or you'll realize this job isn't for you. There's no shame in either outcome."
Jake raised his hand tentatively.
"Excuse me, Chen. What exactly will the training involve?"
Chen's lips curved into what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it.
"Everything, Martinez.
Physical conditioning, technical knowledge, emergency response, leadership under stress, and situations that will test every assumption you have about yourself and this industry. You'll be working with hazardous materials, high-pressure systems, confined spaces, and equipment that could kill you if you make a mistake." David shifted his weight. His military experience had prepared him for tough training, but something about Chen's intensity was different. It wasn't the aggressive posturing he'd encountered from drill sergeants.
This felt more personal, more focused.
"Let me tell you about the last group," Chen said, her voice dropping slightly.
12 trainees started the program 8 months ago.
7 made it to the end.
Of those 7, only 4 are still with the company. This isn't just about learning procedures and protocols.
This is about discovering whether you have what it takes when everything goes wrong and people's lives depend on your decisions." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Marcus found himself wondering what had happened to the trainees who didn't make it. Jake was staring at Chen with a mixture of respect and apprehension. David maintained his military bearing, but his eyes revealed his curiosity about this woman who commanded such authority.
"Questions so far?" Chen asked. "What's your background?" David asked. "Military?" "Good question, Williams." "No, not military. Started here 15 years ago as a maintenance technician.
Worked my way up through safety inspection, emergency response, and incident investigation.
I've seen what happens when people aren't properly prepared for this job.
I've pulled bodies out of confined spaces, investigated explosions that could have been prevented, and written reports about people who died because someone made a careless mistake." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus realized that this wasn't about intimidation for its own sake.
Chen was painting a picture of the real stakes involved in their chosen profession. "The average industrial accident doesn't just hurt one person," she continued.
"It affects families, communities, and entire companies. When a safety system fails, when someone takes a shortcut, when protocols aren't followed, people die.
My job is to make sure that doesn't happen because of something I failed to teach you.
Chen walked over to a large whiteboard covered with what looked like floor plans and emergency procedures. This facility has been designed to simulate real-world conditions you'll encounter in the field. We have mock chemical storage areas, pressure vessel training systems, confined space simulators, and emergency response scenarios that will test your ability to function under stress. She pointed to different areas on the floor plan. Over the next 6 months, you'll rotate through each of these training areas. You'll learn technical skills, but, more importantly, you'll learn to trust your training and your teammates when your adrenaline is pumping and your mind is telling you to panic or run.
Jake looked uncomfortable. Are you saying we'll be in actual danger during training?
No, Martinez. I'm saying we'll create controlled situations that feel dangerous. Your brain doesn't know the difference between a real emergency and a realistic simulation when your heart is racing and alarms are going off. The goal is to build muscle memory and decision-making skills that will serve you when the stakes are real.
Chen walked back to stand in front of them.
But, before we get to any of that, we need to establish some ground rules. First, this is not a competition between the three of you. You succeed or fail together. If one of you struggles with a concept or skill, the others help.
If someone is having a bad day, the team picks them up. Industry safety is about teamwork, not individual heroics.
Marcus nodded, relieved. The competitive atmosphere at his previous job had been exhausting and counterproductive. Second, Chen continued, you will be honest with me and with each other about your limitations and concerns.
Pride kills people in this business. If you don't understand something, ask.
If you're not comfortable with a procedure, speak up. If you think someone is making a mistake, intervene. I'd rather deal with hurt feelings than plan a funeral. David appreciated this directness. It reminded him of the best officers he'd served under, people who cared more about the mission and their people than looking good or maintaining authority. Third, you will push yourselves beyond what you think you're capable of. Not recklessly, but deliberately.
Growth happens at the edge of your comfort zone.
I'll be pushing you, but, ultimately, you'll need to push yourselves. Chen paused, studying each of their faces.
Finally, you will maintain absolute confidentiality about what happens here.
The scenarios we run, the techniques we teach, the mistakes you make and learn from, all of that stays within these walls. The company invests significant resources in this program because it works. We don't need competitors copying our methods or sensationalizing our training for publicity.
She glanced at her watch. It's 8:30.
We'll start each day at 8 o'clock sharp and end at 6 o'clock.
Lunch is 30 minutes. Breaks when I say so.
Your first assignment is to read through these safety manuals and equipment specifications. She handed each of them a thick binder. You'll be tested on the material tomorrow morning.
Questions about the basic requirements? Marcus flipped through his binder, noting the dense technical language and detailed diagrams. How much detail do we need to memorize?
All of it, Chen replied.
But don't worry about memorizing everything tonight.
Understanding the concepts is more important than memorizing specific numbers.
The details will become second nature through repetition during hands-on training.
Jake looked at the size of his binder with obvious concern.
This looks like a lot of material for one night.
It is.
That's intentional. Time management and prioritization are crucial skills in this field.
Figure out what's most important and focus on that. I'm not expecting perfection on your first test, but I am expecting effort and intelligent preparation. Chen led them to a small classroom area with 3 desks and a coffee station. You'll spend this morning reviewing the material and can ask me questions as needed. This afternoon, we'll tour the facility so you can see the equipment you'll be learning to operate and maintain. As they settled into their desks and opened their binders, Marcus found himself stealing glances at Chen. There was something about her confidence and knowledge that commanded respect, but also something guarded, as if she was holding back parts of her story. Jake was already deep in the technical specifications, making notes in the margins and occasionally muttering to himself about pressure ratings and chemical compatibility charts. David approached the material methodically, reading each section carefully before moving on, his military training evident in his systematic approach. Around 10 o'clock, Chen approached Marcus's desk.
"How are you processing the material, Roberts?" "It's challenging," Marcus admitted.
"I have a mechanical background, but some of the chemical safety protocols are new to me."
"Good. Honesty about knowledge gaps will serve you well. What specifically is confusing you?" Marcus pointed to a section about emergency shutdown procedures.
"The sequencing here seems complicated."
"Why wouldn't you just hit an emergency stop button?" Chen pulled up a chair. "Excellent question. Emergency shutdowns aren't always about stopping everything immediately. Sometimes rapid shutdown can create more dangerous conditions than controlled shutdown.
For example, if you're dealing with a pressurized system containing corrosive chemicals, an immediate stop might cause pressure spikes or chemical reactions that are worse than the original problem." She sketched a simple diagram on a piece of paper.
"Think of it like stopping a car.
You could slam on the brakes and stop immediately, but, depending on conditions, that might cause you to skid and lose control.
Sometimes the safest stop is a controlled, rapid deceleration that keeps you in control of the vehicle."
The analogy clicked for Marcus. So the emergency procedures are about maintaining control while reducing risk.
Exactly.
The goal is always to reach the safest possible state given the current conditions. Sometimes that means immediate shutdown, sometimes controlled shutdown, and sometimes maintaining current operations until conditions change. Chen moved on to check with Jake and David, answering their questions with the same patience and clarity. Marcus noticed that she never made anyone feel stupid for asking questions, even basic ones. Instead, she seemed genuinely pleased when they engaged with the material thoughtfully. Around noon, she called them together for lunch break. "Cafeteria is down the hall, or you can eat outside if the weather's nice. Be back here at 12:30. During lunch, the three trainees compared notes and impressions. "She's intense," Jake said, picking at his sandwich.
"But, in a good way, I think.
Like she really knows her stuff."
David nodded.
"I've worked with a lot of instructors.
The good ones challenge you but also make you feel like they want you to succeed. She seems like one of the good ones."
Marcus was quiet for a moment.
"There's something about her story that feels incomplete. 15 years to go from maintenance tech to running the training program?
That's impressive, but I get the sense there's more to it."
"What do you mean?" Jake asked. "I don't know exactly. Just a feeling.
The way she talks about accidents and incidents, it's not just professional knowledge.
It feels personal." David considered this. Maybe that's what makes her good at this job. Personal investment in keeping people safe.
When they returned from lunch, Chen was waiting with hard hats and safety glasses.
"Time for the facility tour. Put these on and follow me. Stay together and don't touch anything unless I tell you to."
The tour was eye-opening. The training facility was much larger than they had realized, with multiple buildings housing different types of equipment and simulation systems. Chen walked them through chemical storage simulations, pressure vessel training systems, confined space entry mock-ups, and emergency response scenarios that looked remarkably realistic. This confined space trainer simulates working inside storage tanks, underground utilities, and other limited access environments, Chen explained as they stood outside a cylindrical structure with a small entrance hatch. "You'll spend considerable time in here learning entry procedures, air monitoring, communication protocols, and emergency extraction." Jake looked at the small hatch with obvious discomfort.
"How small are the spaces we'll be working in?"
"Varies. Some storage tanks are large enough to walk around in comfortably. Others require crawling or working in positions that would make a yoga instructor cringe. The key is knowing your limitations and having proper procedures for every situation." She led them to another area with what looked like a partially constructed industrial building.
"This is our emergency response trainer.
We can simulate equipment failures, chemical spills, fires, medical emergencies, and combinations of problems that test your ability to prioritize and coordinate responses.
David was impressed by the sophistication of the training setup. How realistic are these simulations? Realistic enough that experienced first responders sometimes forget their training.
We use smoke machines, sound effects, mock casualties, and time pressure to create stress levels similar to real emergencies.
The goal is to make your first real emergency feel familiar instead of overwhelming.
They spent the rest of the afternoon touring different training areas and getting an overview of the equipment they'd be learning to operate. By 6 o'clock, all 3 trainees were mentally exhausted from trying to absorb so much new information.
Tomorrow we'll start hands-on training, Chen said as they prepared to leave.
Wear work clothes that you don't mind getting dirty. Steel-toed boots are required.
Any questions before you go?
Just one, Marcus said.
You mentioned that not everyone makes it through the program. What usually causes people to drop out?
Chen considered the question carefully.
Fear is the biggest factor.
Not fear of getting hurt, that's actually healthy and keeps people safe. I'm talking about fear of making mistakes, fear of looking incompetent, fear of taking responsibility for other people's safety. This job requires you to act decisively in situations where hesitation could be deadly.
Some people discover they're not comfortable with that level of responsibility.
She gathered her papers and headed toward the door.
Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow we start finding out what you're made of.
As the 3 trainees walked to their cars, each was lost in his own thoughts about what the next 6 months would bring. They had signed up for safety training, but Chen had made it clear they were in for something much more challenging and transformative. Marcus started his car and headed home, his mind already working through the technical material they'd covered. Something told him that learning the procedures and protocols would be the easy part. The real challenge would be discovering whether he had the mental toughness and decision-making ability that Chen seemed to value above everything else. Jake drove home wondering if he'd made a mistake applying for this position. The intensity of the training program was beyond what he'd expected, and Chen's stories about previous trainees who hadn't made it were weighing on his mind. But something about the challenge appealed to him, and he found himself looking forward to proving he belonged here. David appreciated the professional approach and high standards, but he sensed there were lessons ahead that would test him in ways his military experience hadn't prepared him for. Chen's emphasis on teamwork and personal responsibility resonated with his values, but he suspected the real learning would come when they faced scenarios that pushed all of them beyond their comfort zones. None of them could have predicted how much the next day would change their understanding of their instructor and themselves.
The second day started differently.
When Marcus, Jake, and David arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, they found Chen already in the main training area, but she wasn't alone. 3 other people stood with her, 2 men and a woman, all wearing the same practical work clothes and serious expressions that seemed to be the standard uniform around here.
Good morning, Chen said as the trainees approached. I want you to meet some people.
This is Tom Bradley, our Senior Emergency Response Coordinator. Maria Santos, Chemical Safety Specialist. And Rick Patterson, Confined Space Rescue Team Leader.
Tom stepped forward first.
He was a big man with calloused hands and the kind of tan that came from working outdoors for years.
Pleasure to meet you guys. Chen's told us good things about your first day.
Maria was smaller but carried herself with quiet confidence. When she spoke, her voice had the clarity of someone used to giving instructions in crisis situations.
We'll be working with you throughout your training. Think of us as your backup instructors and reality check.
Rick was somewhere in his 50s, with gray hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. Chen's the best trainer in the business, he said simply.
But sometimes it helps to hear the same lessons from different perspectives. David immediately liked this team approach.
In the military, he'd learned that the best training programs used multiple instructors with different specialties and experiences.
Chen gestured toward the confined space trainer they'd seen during yesterday's tour.
Today we're starting with basic confined space entry. Nothing complicated, just learning the fundamentals of air monitoring, entry procedures, and communication protocols. Tom will be your safety monitor, Maria will handle air quality assessment, and Rick will demonstrate proper entry techniques.
Jake felt his stomach tighten. He'd been dreading this part since seeing the small entry hatch yesterday.
Before anyone goes into the trainer, we're going to talk through every step of the process, Chen continued. In this business, understanding why we do things is just as important as knowing how to do them.
Martinez, what did you learn from last night's reading about confined space hazards? Jake consulted his notes.
Oxygen deficiency, toxic gases, explosive atmospheres, and physical hazards like moving equipment or unstable surfaces.
Good. Roberts, what's the first step in any confined space entry? Marcus had been reviewing this section during his drive-in. Testing the atmospheric conditions and establishing continuous air monitoring. Excellent. Williams, who enters the space first?
David thought back to his military training with similar situations. The attendant or safety monitor establishes communication and monitoring protocols before the entrant goes in.
Perfect. Now let's see how this works in practice.
Maria wheeled over a cart containing air monitoring equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Digital displays, multiple sensors, and warning lights covered the device. This is a multi-gas detector, she explained. It continuously monitors oxygen levels, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and combustible gases. Before anyone enters a confined space, we test the atmosphere at the top, middle, and bottom of the space. She demonstrated the testing procedure at the confined space trainer, lowering the sensor probe through the entry hatch and reading measurements at different depths.
Oxygen should be between 19.5 and 23.5%.
Carbon monoxide should be below 35 parts per million.
Hydrogen sulfide below 10 ppm. Combustible gases below 10% of their lower explosive limit.
Jake watched intently as the digital readouts displayed safe readings. The equipment was more sophisticated than he'd expected, but the systematic approach was reassuring.
Rick took over the demonstration. Entry procedures are about redundancy and communication.
The entrant wears a safety harness connected to a retrieval line.
The attendant maintains constant communication and is ready to begin emergency retrieval if needed.
The entry supervisor monitors the overall operation and makes go/no-go decisions. He put on a safety harness and demonstrated the proper connection of the retrieval line.
The harness isn't just for emergency extraction. It's also psychological support.
Knowing you're connected to your team helps manage the natural anxiety of working in a confined space.
Marcus could see the wisdom in this approach.
It wasn't just about safety procedures, it was about building confidence through systematic preparation.
Chen stepped forward. Now each of you will perform a practice entry. We'll start with Roberts.
Martinez and Williams, you'll take turns as attendant and entry supervisor.
Everyone rotates through all positions so you understand the complete process.
Marcus put on the safety harness while Tom helped him adjust the straps and check the connections.
The equipment felt substantial but not overwhelming. Remember, Chen said, this is just familiarization.
You'll be in the trainer for maybe 5 minutes, just long enough to understand what it feels like and practice the communication procedures.
Maria handed Marcus a portable radio. Test your communication before entry. Call out anything that makes you uncomfortable once you're inside. Marcus keyed the radio. Testing communication. Can everyone hear me clearly? Loud and clear, Jake replied from his position as attendant. David, acting as entry supervisor, ran through a checklist. Atmospheric testing complete and acceptable. Entry team briefed on procedures. Emergency equipment ready. Entrant ready for entry?
Ready, Marcus replied, surprised by how formal and professional the process felt.
He lowered himself through the hatch into the cylindrical trainer.
The space was larger than it looked from outside, big enough to stand and move around, but small enough that he could touch the walls by extending his arms. Fluorescent lights provided good visibility, but he could imagine how claustrophobic this might feel in a real emergency situation.
How are you doing in there, Roberts?
Chen's voice came through the radio clearly. Good. It's smaller than I expected, but not uncomfortable. I can see how the systematic approach would be important in a real situation.
Excellent.
Practice moving around and reporting your observations.
Remember, in a real confined space entry, continuous communication is crucial.
Marcus spent several minutes exploring the trainer, practicing radio communication, and getting comfortable with the feel of working while connected to the retrieval line. When he climbed out, he felt accomplished and slightly more confident about this aspect of the job.
Jake's turn was more challenging.
As he approached the entry hatch, his nervousness was obvious.
Chen noticed immediately. Martinez, talk to me. What's going through your mind? Honestly?
I'm not great with small spaces.
This is definitely outside my comfort zone.
Good. Recognizing that puts you ahead of people who pretend they're not nervous. Anxiety is normal and manageable if you acknowledge it and use your training.
Rick stepped in.
I've been doing confined space work for 20 years, and I still get a little anxious before difficult entries. The key is trusting your equipment, your procedures, and your team. Jake took a deep breath and put on the safety harness.
Okay, let's do this.
His entry was slower and more cautious than Marcus's, but he completed the exercise successfully. When he emerged, he was clearly relieved but also pleased with himself.
How was it?
David asked.
Scary but manageable.
Having the radio connection and knowing you guys were right here made a huge difference.
David's military background showed during his entry.
He moved efficiently and confidently, communicating clearly and completing the familiarization exercise without apparent difficulty. When all three had completed their practice entries, Chen gathered them for debriefing.
What did you learn from this exercise? She asked.
That the systematic approach really works, Marcus said. Breaking the process down into specific steps made it feel manageable instead of overwhelming.
Jake nodded. The team approach is crucial. Knowing someone's monitoring you and ready to help makes a huge psychological difference. The equipment is more sophisticated than I expected, David added.
And the communication protocols are just as important as the safety gear.
Chen smiled, the first genuinely warm expression they'd seen from her.
Excellent observations. Now let me tell you why we started with confined space training.
She walked over to a whiteboard and drew a simple diagram. Confined space incidents have some of the highest fatality rates in industrial safety. When things go wrong, they go wrong fast and often affect multiple people.
Rescue attempts frequently turn into additional casualties because people rush in without proper procedures.
Maria stepped forward. The deadliest confined space incident I ever investigated involved 3 fatalities.
A maintenance worker collapsed in a storage tank from hydrogen sulfide exposure. His supervisor went in to help without proper equipment or air monitoring. When he collapsed too, a third worker tried to rescue both of them. All 3 died. The weight of her words settled over the trainees. This wasn't abstract theory, these were real consequences of inadequate training and poor decision-making. That incident happened because people panicked and abandoned their training, Chen said. The supervisor knew proper confined space procedures but ignored them in the heat of the moment. The third worker had no confined space training at all but thought he could improvise a rescue.
Rick added, the tragedy is that all 3 deaths were preventable.
If the first collapse had been handled with proper emergency procedures, everyone would have gone home safely that night.
Jake looked shaken. How do you prevent panic in a real emergency?
Training, Chen replied simply.
Lots of realistic training that builds automatic responses.
When your adrenaline is pumping and your conscious mind is screaming at you to do something immediately, your body falls back on whatever responses are most deeply programmed.
Tom nodded.
That's why we spend so much time on communication protocols and systematic procedures. In an emergency, you need responses that don't require conscious thought.
Chen looked at her watch. This afternoon we'll do emergency response scenarios. You'll practice being the attendant when someone needs emergency extraction from a confined space. But, first, let's talk about decision-making under stress.
She led them to a classroom area with a large projection screen. I want to show you something that will help you understand why we train the way we do. The screen displayed what looked like security camera footage from an industrial facility.
This is from an actual incident at a chemical plant 3 years ago.
Watch how quickly things escalate and how people respond.
The footage showed workers going about normal operations when alarms suddenly began sounding.
At first, people looked around uncertainly, then, someone pointed toward a piece of equipment that was emitting white vapor. Within seconds, workers were moving quickly but purposefully toward emergency stations and evacuation routes.
Notice anything about their response? Chen asked.
They didn't panic, David observed. Everyone seemed to know exactly what to do.
Exactly.
This facility had excellent training and clear procedures. Everyone followed their emergency protocols, and the incident was contained with no injuries.
Now watch this.
She switched to another video, this one grainy and, obviously from a lower quality security system. The initial incident looked similar, equipment malfunction and vapor release, but the response was completely different. Workers stood around pointing and talking, some moved toward the problem instead of away from it, and the evacuation was chaotic and slow. This facility had minimal safety training and poorly defined emergency procedures. The incident escalated into a major chemical release that injured 12 people and required evacuation of the surrounding area. Marcus was studying both videos carefully. The equipment failure looked similar in both cases.
It was.
The difference was entirely in human response. Training, procedures, and leadership under pressure determined whether people went home safely or went to the hospital.
Chen switched off the projector.
That's what the next 6 months are about. Building the kind of automatic responses that saved lives in the first video and preventing the chaos that caused injuries in the second.
Maria stood up. Let's grab lunch and, then, we'll start emergency response scenarios.
This afternoon you'll practice being the person who has to make quick decisions when someone's life depends on your actions. During lunch, the 3 trainees processed what they'd learned during the morning session. That video really drove home why this training is so intensive, Marcus said.
The difference between good and poor emergency response is dramatic. Jake was still thinking about the confined space fatality story. 3 people died because someone panicked and ignored procedures. That's terrifying.
But also preventable, David pointed out.
That's why they're putting so much emphasis on systematic training. Building responses that work even when you're scared or stressed.
When they returned from lunch, they found the emergency response training area set up with props, sound effects equipment, and what looked like a smoke machine.
This afternoon you'll experience realistic emergency scenarios, Chen announced.
We'll start with a simple confined space emergency and build up to more complex situations.
The goal is to practice decision-making and teamwork under stress.
Rick was adjusting equipment near the confined space trainer. The scenarios are designed to feel real. You'll hear alarms, see smoke, and face time pressure that forces you to act quickly. Remember, your training kicks in automatically if you let it.
Tom added, don't worry about making mistakes. That's how you learn.
We'd rather you make every possible mistake here in training than make your first mistake in a real emergency. Chen handed each trainee a radio and a clipboard with emergency procedures. Roberts, you're the entry supervisor for the first scenario.
Martinez and Williams, you're the attendants. In 5 minutes, you'll hear alarms indicating an emergency in the confined space.
Your job is to respond according to procedures and extract the casualty safely. She gestured toward Maria, who was putting on a safety harness.
Santos will be playing the role of the casualty.
She'll be unconscious and unable to assist with her own rescue.
You'll need to coordinate her extraction using the retrieval system.
As the trainees took their positions, Marcus felt his heart rate increasing.
Even knowing this was just training, the prospect of being responsible for someone's rescue was intimidating.
Remember, Chen called out, communication is crucial. Talk through every step, report what you're seeing, and don't hesitate to ask for help or clarification. The alarms began suddenly and loudly, echoing through the training facility. Red lights flashed, and the smoke machine began creating a hazy atmosphere around the confined space trainer. Emergency, emergency, came through the radio system.
Worker down in Tank 7. Requesting immediate assistance.
Marcus felt his training kick in.
This is Entry Supervisor Roberts responding to emergency at Tank 7.
Martinez, Williams, report to your stations.
Stand by for atmospheric testing.
Jake grabbed the air monitoring equipment while David positioned himself at the retrieval line. Despite the simulated nature of the emergency, all three men found themselves moving quickly and purposefully. The scenario continued for 20 minutes, with Chen and her team adding complications and time pressure that forced the trainees to adapt and problem-solve in real time. By the end, they had successfully extracted the casualty and completed emergency procedures.
Outstanding work, Chen said as the alarms fell silent.
You followed procedures, communicated effectively, and completed a successful rescue.
How did it feel?
Intense, Marcus said. My heart was racing the whole time, but having clear procedures really helped focus my thinking.
Jake was surprised by his own performance.
I was nervous beforehand, but once the emergency started, I just concentrated on doing my job correctly.
David nodded.
The systematic approach really works. Even with all the distractions and stress, following the checklist kept us organized.
Chen gathered them for debriefing.
The scenario you just completed is based on an actual confined space rescue that happened 2 years ago. A maintenance worker collapsed from chemical exposure, and the response team extracted him successfully using the same procedures you just practiced. Maria added, real emergencies feel very similar to what you just experienced. Time pressure, incomplete information, equipment that doesn't work perfectly, and the stress of knowing someone's life depends on your actions.
Rick was noting observations on a clipboard.
You made some minor mistakes that we'll work on, but overall your response was professional and effective. Most importantly, you trusted your training and worked as a team.
Tom pointed to specific areas for improvement.
Roberts, you did well as supervisor but need to delegate more clearly. Martinez, your air monitoring was thorough but took too long. Practice will increase your speed. Williams, excellent work on the retrieval system, but communicate your actions more clearly so the supervisor knows what's happening. As the day ended, Chen addressed the group one final time.
Today you got your first taste of emergency response under pressure.
Tomorrow we'll increase the complexity and add more variables. The goal is to build confidence and competence gradually so that real emergencies feel manageable instead of overwhelming. As the trainees prepared to leave, Marcus realized that his understanding of industrial safety work had changed dramatically in just 2 days. This wasn't just about following procedures and avoiding accidents, it was about developing the skills and mindset needed to save lives when things went wrong. Jake drove home feeling accomplished but also aware of how much he still needed to learn. The confined space work had been challenging, but succeeding at the emergency scenario had built his confidence significantly. David appreciated the professional approach and realistic training. His military background had prepared him for high-stress situations, but this specialized emergency response training was expanding his skills in new directions. None of them realized that tomorrow would bring revelations about their instructor that would change their understanding of why Chen demanded such high standards and why she seemed so personally invested in their success. The intensive training was just the beginning of discovering what had shaped their instructor into the demanding professional who was pushing them to excel. The third day started like the others, but something felt different. Chen was already in the training area when they arrived, but instead of her usual confident demeanor, she seemed distracted. She was staring at a piece of equipment with an intensity that went beyond normal inspection. Morning, Chen, Marcus said as the three trainees approached. She turned, and, for just a moment, they saw something in her eyes that wasn't usually there, a flicker of vulnerability quickly replaced by her professional mask.
Good morning. Today we're working with pressure vessel safety and emergency shutdown procedures.
Her voice was steady, but Jake noticed she was gripping her clipboard tighter than usual.
Tom and Maria were setting up equipment near a large cylindrical tank that dominated one corner of the training facility. The tank was painted bright yellow with multiple gauges, valves, and warning signs covering its surface. This pressure vessel trainer simulates the systems you'll encounter in chemical plants, refineries, and manufacturing facilities, Chen explained. We'll be practicing normal operating procedures, emergency shutdowns, and pressure relief operations. Rick joined them, carrying what looked like a thick operations manual. Pressure vessels contain tremendous energy. A failure can destroy buildings and kill people hundreds of feet away. That's why we have extensive safety systems and very specific procedures for every operation. David studied the complex array of controls and monitoring equipment. What kind of pressures are we talking about? This trainer operates up to 150 psi, which is relatively low pressure, Maria answered. Real industrial systems can operate at thousands of psi. The physics don't change, but the consequences of mistakes become much more severe. Chen walked them through the basic components: pressure gauges, temperature sensors, relief valves, and emergency shutdown systems. Her explanations were thorough and professional, but the trainees noticed she kept checking her watch and seemed less patient with questions than usual. The most critical concept is pressure relief, she said, pointing to several spring-loaded valves. These safety valves automatically open if pressure exceeds safe limits. They're designed to prevent catastrophic failure by releasing pressure in a controlled manner. Marcus was taking notes as Chen explained the interplay between pressure, temperature, and safety systems. What happens if the relief valves fail? Catastrophic rupture, Chen replied flatly. The vessel explodes, sending metal fragments in all directions and releasing whatever was inside under pressure. Depending on the contents, you could have fire, toxic gas clouds, or both. Jake noticed that Chen's description lacked her usual elaboration and context. She was giving them the facts but not the deeper understanding she typically provided. Tom took over the demonstration of startup procedures. Bringing a pressure vessel online requires following specific sequences to avoid thermal shock and pressure spikes. We'll practice the complete startup routine so you understand how each step affects system safety. For the next 2 hours, they rotated through different roles, learning to operate controls, monitor systems, and respond to various alarm conditions. The work was technically challenging but engaging, and the trainees found themselves gaining confidence with the equipment. Around 10:30, Chen's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her face went pale. "Excuse me for a moment," she said, stepping away to take a phone call. The trainees couldn't hear the conversation, but they could see Chen's body language change. She stood straighter, her voice became clipped and professional, and she began pacing while she talked. Tom noticed their curiosity. "Keep working through the shutdown procedures. Chen will be back shortly." But Chen didn't return shortly. 5 minutes became 10, then 15. When she finally came back, she looked shaken. "Change of plans," she announced. "We're going to focus on emergency response scenarios today. Specifically, pressure vessel emergencies." Maria and Rick exchanged glances. This clearly wasn't part of the planned curriculum. "Is everything okay?" Marcus asked. Chen paused, seeming to weigh how much to share. "There's been an incident at one of our client facilities. No one was hurt, but it's the kind of situation we train for. I think it would be valuable for you to understand how quickly these emergencies develop and why our procedures exist." She led them to the classroom area and pulled up what looked like an incident report on the projection screen. "This happened 3 hours ago at a chemical processing plant in Ohio. A pressure relief valve failed during routine operations, causing an uncontrolled release of pressurized chemicals. The facility was evacuated successfully, and there were no injuries, but it could have been much worse." The incident report included photos of damaged equipment and a timeline of events. The trainees could see that the failure had caused significant property damage and disrupted operations for the entire facility. "The failure happened because of improper maintenance," Chen continued. "The relief valve hadn't been tested according to schedule, and internal components had corroded beyond safe limits. When the system experienced a pressure spike, the valve couldn't open properly. Jake studied the photos. How do you prevent this kind of failure?
Systematic maintenance, regular testing, and never ignoring warning signs, Chen replied.
But also understanding that equipment can fail despite our best efforts. That's why we have multiple layers of protection and emergency procedures.
David noticed something in Chen's voice that hadn't been there before, a personal edge that suggested this incident meant more to her than just a training example. The facility in Ohio is owned by Meridian Chemical, Chen continued. I helped design their safety training program 2 years ago.
I know the people who responded to this emergency.
The pieces began falling into place for Marcus. Chen's distraction, the phone call, her emotional response, this wasn't just a random incident she was using for training. She was personally connected to what had happened.
Tom stepped forward.
Chen, maybe we should stick to the planned curriculum today.
No, Chen said firmly. This is exactly the kind of situation they need to understand. Emergency response is an abstract theory, it's about real people in real danger making life or death decisions based on their training.
She turned back to the trainees. I want to tell you about the last time I responded to a pressure vessel emergency. It was 8 years ago, and it changed everything about how I think about safety training.
Maria looked concerned. Chen, are you sure you want to go into this today?
Yes, Chen replied. They need to understand why we do things the way we do. She dimmed the lights and brought up a different set of photos on the screen. These were clearly from an accident scene, twisted metal, emergency vehicles, and damage that looked far more severe than the Ohio incident.
This was at a petrochemical plant in Louisiana.
I was part of the emergency response team investigating a pressure vessel failure that killed 3 people and injured 12 others.
The silence in the room was complete.
Even Tom, Maria, and Rick seemed surprised that Chen was sharing this story. The vessel was a reactor containing chemicals under high pressure and temperature. It had been operating normally for months when a weld failure caused catastrophic rupture. The explosion was heard 3 miles away. Chen's voice remained steady, but the trainees could see the emotional weight of what she was describing.
The 3 fatalities were all experienced operators who followed proper emergency procedures.
They did everything right, but the failure was so sudden and severe that they couldn't reach safety in time.
Marcus felt his understanding of their training program shifting.
Chen wasn't just teaching them procedures and safety protocols, she was preparing them for situations where people's lives hung in the balance and split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. The investigation revealed that the weld failure was caused by improper inspection procedures. The defect had been present for months but wasn't detected because the inspection was superficial and incomplete.
Jake realized he was holding his breath. What could have prevented it? Better training for the inspection team. More rigorous procedures. Different equipment design.
Multiple small changes that individually seemed minor but together could have saved 3 lives. Chen paused, staring at the accident photos. I spent 6 months investigating that incident. I interviewed families, reviewed procedures, analyzed equipment, and wrote recommendations. But the thing that stayed with me was how preventable it all was.
David understood now why Chen demanded such high standards and attention to detail.
This wasn't about following rules for their own sake, it was about preventing tragedies that destroyed families and communities. After that investigation, I decided to leave incident response and focus on training. I figured preventing accidents was more important than investigating them after people were already dead.
Tom spoke quietly. That's when you came to Morrison Industries.
Yes.
I wanted to build the kind of training program that would prevent the mistakes I'd seen in Louisiana.
Not just teaching procedures, but developing the mindset and decision-making skills that keep people safe when everything goes wrong. Chen turned to face the trainees directly.
That's why your training is so intensive.
Why we practice emergency scenarios until your responses become automatic. Why we emphasize teamwork and communication and systematic thinking.
Because somewhere, someday, you might be the person who prevents a tragedy or the person who responds when prevention isn't enough. The weight of responsibility in her words was sobering. Marcus realized that their 6 months of training was about much more than landing a good job. They were being prepared to be guardians of other people's safety. The incident in Ohio this morning brought it all back, Chen continued. Same type of equipment, similar failure mode, but a completely different outcome because their emergency response was excellent. That's the difference good training makes. Maria stood up. Maybe we should take a break. No, Chen said. We're going to practice pressure vessel emergency response. Right now. Because understanding the consequences makes the training real. She led them back to the pressure vessel trainer, but now the equipment looked different to the trainees. Instead of just complicated machinery, they saw a system capable of tremendous destruction if not properly managed. We're going to simulate a pressure relief valve failure, Chen announced. You'll need to recognize the emergency, implement proper shutdown procedures, and coordinate evacuation while dealing with time pressure and incomplete information. Rick was setting up monitoring equipment and safety systems. Remember, in a real emergency, you might not have all the information you want. You'll need to make decisions based on partial data and trust your training. Tom positioned himself at the emergency shutdown controls. Your job is to assess the situation, determine the appropriate response, and execute it safely. Chen will be adding complications and distractions to test your decision-making. The simulation began with normal operations. The trainees took turns monitoring systems, adjusting controls, and following routine procedures. Then, alarms began sounding. Pressure relief valve malfunction, Chen announced over the intercom. System pressure rising beyond normal limits. Respond according to emergency procedures. Marcus, acting as the shift supervisor, felt his heart rate spike as he assessed the control panel. Red warning lights were flashing, and multiple alarms were demanding attention. Jake, start emergency shutdown sequence, he called out. David, contact emergency response team and prepare for possible evacuation. The scenario unfolded rapidly, with Chen adding complications that forced them to adapt their response. Communication systems failed, backup equipment didn't work as expected, and time pressure mounted as simulated conditions continued to deteriorate. Pressure continuing to rise, Chen announced. Relief system not responding. You have 2 minutes to achieve safe shutdown or evacuation will be mandatory. Jake's hands were steady as he worked through the emergency procedures, despite the stress of the scenario. His practice with the confined space emergencies had built confidence that carried over to this situation. David was coordinating with the simulated emergency response team, providing clear updates on facility status and personnel locations. His military background in crisis communication was evident in his calm, professional reports. Marcus was synthesizing information from multiple sources and making rapid decisions about priorities and resource allocation. The systematic approach Chen had drilled into them was allowing him to function effectively despite the pressure. Emergency shutdown complete, Jake announced. System pressure stabilizing within safe limits. Evacuation protocols implemented, David added. All personnel accounted for and clear of danger zones. Excellent work, Chen said as the alarms fell silent. You just prevented a potential catastrophe through proper training and teamwork. But, instead of looking pleased, Chen seemed emotionally drained by the exercise. Tom approached her quietly. Chen, you've been through enough today. Why don't you let us handle the afternoon session? For the first time since they'd known her, Chen didn't argue or insist on maintaining control. You're right. Roberts, Martinez, Williams, excellent work today. Tom will continue your training this afternoon. As Chen gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Marcus found the courage to speak up. Chen, thank you for sharing your story about Louisiana. It helps us understand why this training matters so much. She paused at the door. Those 3 operators in Louisiana were good people doing their best with the training they had. They deserved better preparation, better procedures, and better support. I can't bring them back, but
I can make sure you're better prepared than they were." After Chen left, the atmosphere in the training facility was different. Tom, Maria, and Rick seemed more serious, and the trainees approached the afternoon exercises with a deeper understanding of what was at stake. During a break, Jake voiced what they were all thinking. "I had no idea she was carrying that kind of weight. 3 people dying because of inadequate training, that would change anyone."
David nodded. "Explains why she's so demanding. She's not just teaching us procedures, she's trying to prevent future tragedies."
Marcus was processing the emotional revelation alongside the technical training.
"Makes me think differently about every detail she's taught us. It's not just about following rules, it's about understanding why the rules exist."
The afternoon session focused on equipment inspection and maintenance procedures, but the trainees approached it with new seriousness. Every gauge reading, every valve position, every safety check took on deeper meaning when they understood the consequences of mistakes. Tom shared additional stories about maintenance failures and their consequences, but with less emotional weight than Chen's revelation. His examples were educational rather than personal, helping them understand technical concepts without the psychological burden Chen had been carrying. "Proper inspection requires more than just going through the motions," he explained as they practiced valve testing procedures. "You need to understand what you're looking for and why it matters."
Maria demonstrated chemical analysis techniques that could detect equipment degradation before it became dangerous. Early detection gives you time to plan repairs and replacements.
Emergency repairs are always more dangerous and expensive than planned maintenance.
Rick shared lessons from equipment failures he'd investigated.
The most dangerous failures are the ones that develop slowly over time.
By the time you notice obvious symptoms, you might already be past the point of safe operation.
As the day ended, the trainees had a completely different understanding of their instructor and their training program. Chen's demanding standards and intensive scenarios weren't just educational choices, they were her way of honoring the memory of 3 operators who had died because their training hadn't been enough. When they left that evening, each trainee was processing not just new technical knowledge, but a deeper understanding of the responsibility they were accepting. Marcus drove home thinking about how Chen's personal tragedy had shaped her approach to preventing future accidents. Jake was reflecting on the weight of responsibility that came with safety-critical work. David was considering how his military experience with life and death decisions would translate to industrial safety. None of them could have predicted that tomorrow would bring the most challenging test yet, a scenario that would push their skills to the limit and reveal just how much Chen's intensive training had prepared them for the moment when theoretical knowledge became life-saving action. The 4th day began with an unexpected announcement. When Marcus, Jake, and David arrived at 8 o'clock, they found Chen waiting with Tom, Maria, and Rick, but the usual training equipment was nowhere to be seen. "Good morning," Chen said, and the trainees immediately noticed she seemed different, more focused and intense than even her usual professional demeanor.
"Today's training will be different. Instead of planned scenarios, you're going to respond to an actual emergency." Jake felt his stomach drop. "What kind of emergency?"
"A real one," Chen replied.
20 minutes ago, we received a call from Riverside Manufacturing. They're experiencing equipment problems that could escalate into a serious incident. They've requested emergency technical support."
David's military training kicked in immediately.
"What's our role?" Tom stepped forward. "Riverside is one of Morrison's clients.
They have good people, but this situation is beyond their normal capabilities. They need experienced emergency response support, and, frankly, they need it faster than we can get a full team there."
Maria was checking equipment in several large cases. "Chen recommended sending you 3 along as support personnel."
"It's unusual to send trainees into an actual emergency, but your training has been exceptional, and this could be a valuable learning experience." Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and terror.
"Are we qualified for real emergency response?" "That's what we're about to find out," Chen said. "But understand, this isn't a training exercise. Real people are depending on professional response. If you're not ready for that level of responsibility, speak up now." Rick was loading equipment into vehicles.
The situation is currently stable but could deteriorate quickly. We'll be providing technical support and emergency coordination. Your job will be to assist experienced responders and apply your training in real conditions.
Chen handed each trainee a thick folder. Incident briefing materials. Study them during the drive.
Riverside operates a chemical processing facility with pressure vessels, confined spaces, and hazardous materials.
Everything we've been training for.
As they loaded into vehicles for the 40-minute drive to Riverside, the trainees reviewed the briefing materials. The facility processed industrial chemicals using high-pressure reactors and storage systems. The current problem involved a pressure vessel that had developed an abnormal vibration and was showing signs of potential mechanical failure. The vibration started during routine operations, Tom explained as he drove. Their maintenance team shut down the system immediately, but they're not sure if it's safe to restart or how to investigate the problem without risking personnel safety. Chen, riding in the passenger seat, was coordinating with Riverside personnel via radio. Their facility manager is experienced, but they don't have anyone trained in advanced pressure vessel diagnostics.
That's where we come in.
David, studying the facility layout, noticed the complexity of the operation. This looks like a much more sophisticated facility than our training mock-ups.
It is, Maria replied from the back seat.
But the principles are exactly the same. The difference is that mistakes have real consequences instead of just ending the exercise. Jake was reading technical specifications for the problematic equipment. The pressure vessel is rated for 300 psi and contains corrosive chemicals.
If it fails catastrophically,
people die, Chen finished. That's why we're here. As they approached the facility, the trainees could see it was a substantial industrial operation, multiple buildings, storage tanks, and the kind of infrastructure that supported dozens of workers and significant chemical processing capacity. They were met at the gate by Jim Rodriguez, Riverside's facility manager, a man in his 50s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in industrial operations.
"Thank you for coming so quickly," he said as Chen's team unloaded their equipment.
"We've got the system shut down, but we need expert assessment of whether it's safe to investigate the problem."
Chen took charge immediately.
"Show us the equipment and brief us on what happened."
As they walked through the facility, Jim explained the timeline. Normal operations yesterday, systems seemed fine. This morning during startup, operators noticed abnormal vibration in reactor vessel R204.
They followed shutdown procedures immediately, but we haven't been able to determine the cause. The reactor in question was massive, easily 3 times the size of their training equipment. It was surrounded by complex piping, instrumentation, and safety systems that made their practice facility look simple by comparison. Tom was already examining monitoring equipment.
"What kind of vibration analysis capability do you have?"
"Basic monitoring, but nothing sophisticated enough for detailed diagnostics," Jim replied.
"That's why we called you." Chen turned to the trainees. "This is where your training becomes real. We need to develop a safe approach for investigating this problem. Roberts, what's your assessment of the initial situation?"
Marcus felt the weight of responsibility as he studied the equipment and consulted his briefing materials.
"System is currently shut down and isolated.
We need to verify isolation effectiveness, assess atmospheric conditions around the vessel, and establish safety protocols before any investigation begins."
"Good. Martinez, what about personnel safety?"
Jake was already thinking through confined space and chemical exposure protocols. "We need to establish exclusion zones, verify air quality, and ensure emergency response resources are ready before anyone approaches the vessel."
"Excellent. Williams, what investigation approach would you recommend?" David considered the technical options.
External inspection first to check for obvious damage, then systematic diagnostic procedures working from safest to most complex. We need to understand the failure mode before recommending any corrective action.
Chen nodded approvingly. "Outstanding assessments. Now let's implement them."
For the next 2 hours, the trainees found themselves applying their training in conditions far more complex and demanding than any simulation. They established safety perimeters, conducted atmospheric monitoring, and worked with riverside personnel to gather information about the equipment problem. Maria was setting up sophisticated diagnostic equipment that could analyze vibrations and detect mechanical problems without requiring personnel to enter dangerous areas. This equipment can identify bearing problems, misalignment issues, and structural damage from a safe distance. Tom was coordinating with Riverside's maintenance team, sharing expertise about diagnostic procedures and safety protocols.
Your initial response was exactly right.
Shutting down immediately when you noticed abnormal conditions probably prevented a serious failure. Rick was establishing communication protocols and emergency response readiness. If this situation escalates, we need to be ready for rapid evacuation and emergency shutdown of related systems.
As the diagnostic equipment began providing data, a picture of the problem started to emerge.
Bearing failure in the main drive assembly, Maria announced. The vibration is caused by mechanical wear that's approaching dangerous levels.
Chen studied the data. Prognosis? If we continued operating, complete bearing failure within hours.
That would have caused shaft misalignment and possible vessel damage.
Jim looked relieved. So shutting down when we did prevented a catastrophic failure? Almost certainly, Tom confirmed. Good call by your operators.
But Chen was still studying the diagnostic data with concern.
There's something else here.
Roberts, look at this vibration pattern and tell me what you see. Marcus examined the data, applying the analytical techniques they'd practiced during training.
The bearing failure seems to be secondary. There's an underlying pattern that suggests.
He paused, suddenly, understanding what Chen was seeing. The bearing failure was caused by something else.
The primary problem is still active. Exactly. Martinez, what could cause this kind of pattern?
Jake studied the data, his training in systematic analysis kicking in despite the pressure of the real-world situation. Foundation settling, piping stress, or structural damage that's putting abnormal loads on the equipment.
Williams, how do we investigate those possibilities safely?
David was already thinking through the technical options. External structural inspection, foundation survey, and piping stress analysis. All can be done without entering confined spaces or pressurizing the system.
Chen turned to Jim.
We need to expand our investigation.
The bearing failure was a symptom, not the root cause.
Your facility could have a more serious structural problem.
The next several hours involved detailed investigation that tested every aspect of the trainees' preparation.
They worked with sophisticated diagnostic equipment, coordinated with multiple teams of specialists, and made decisions that affected facility operations and personnel safety. During the investigation, they discovered that recent construction work near the facility had caused foundation settling that put abnormal stress on the reactor system. The bearing failure was just the first visible sign of a problem that could have eventually caused catastrophic equipment failure. If this had continued undetected, you would have lost the entire reactor system, Chen explained to Jim as they reviewed their findings. Possibly with casualties depending on how the failure progressed.
Tom was developing recommendations for corrective action.
Foundation stabilization, structural reinforcement, and complete mechanical inspection of all affected equipment. It's a significant project, but much less expensive than rebuilding after a catastrophic failure.
Maria was preparing a detailed technical report. The good news is we caught it early. With proper corrective action, you can return to safe operations.
Rick was coordinating with Riverside's management about implementation of the recommendations. The safety shutdown systems worked exactly as designed.
Your operators did everything right. As the emergency response concluded, Chen gathered the trainees for debriefing.
How did it feel to apply your training in a real emergency? She asked.
Intense, Marcus said.
But the systematic approach really worked. Even with all the complexity and pressure, following our training procedures kept us focused and effective.
Jake nodded.
I was nervous at first, but once we started working through the problem methodically, it felt like an extension of our practice scenarios. David was impressed by how well their training had prepared them. The real situation was more complex than our simulations, but the fundamental principles were identical. Our training gave us a framework that adapted to the actual conditions. Chen smiled, the first genuinely pleased expression they'd seen from her all week. You just prevented a potential disaster that could have killed people and destroyed this facility. More importantly, you did it by applying systematic training and professional decision-making. Jim approached as they prepared to leave.
I can't thank you enough.
Our operators knew to shut down when something seemed wrong, but we didn't have the expertise to understand what we were dealing with. Your team probably saved lives today. Tom was packing equipment.
Your people did everything right.
The early detection and immediate shutdown were exactly the right response.
Maria added, with proper corrective action, this facility will be safer than it was before the problem developed. During the drive back to Morrison Industries, the atmosphere was different from any of their previous training days. The trainees had successfully transitioned from students to functioning emergency response professionals.
That was real, Jake said, still processing the experience.
We actually helped prevent a serious industrial accident.
David was reflecting on how their military-style training had prepared them for the civilian emergency.
Chen's emphasis on systematic procedures and teamwork made all the difference. When things got complex, we fell back on our training automatically. Marcus was thinking about Chen's story from the previous day. I understand now why she was so demanding during training. If we hadn't been prepared for real-world complexity, we couldn't have contributed to today's response. Chen, who had been quiet during the drive, finally spoke.
Today you proved that intensive training works. You applied complex technical knowledge under pressure, worked effectively as a team, and made decisions that protected people's safety.
That's what this program is designed to produce. Tom added, most trainees don't get the chance to participate in actual emergency response until much later in their careers. You've seen why all the training matters.
When they returned to the facility, word had already spread about the successful emergency response.
Other Morrison Industries personnel were congratulating them and asking for details about the incident. How does it feel to know you helped prevent a potential catastrophe? Maria asked as they unloaded equipment.
Humbling, Marcus replied. It makes the responsibility of this work very real. Jake was energized by the experience.
I want to learn everything I can so I'm ready for the next emergency. David was thinking about the teamwork aspects.
The combination of individual expertise and team coordination was crucial. No one person could have solved that problem alone. As the day ended, Chen addressed them one final time.
Today you transitioned from trainees to safety professionals.
You'll continue learning and developing your skills, but you've proven you have the foundation needed to protect people's lives and prevent industrial disasters. She paused, and the trainees could see the pride in her eyes. The 3 operators who died in Louisiana would have been proud of your performance today.
You embodied everything I hoped to build into this training program. Rick added, emergency response is about preparation meeting opportunity. When Riverside needed help, you were ready.
As Marcus, Jake, and David drove home that evening, each was processing not just the technical success of the day, but the personal transformation they'd experienced. They had arrived 4 days earlier as job applicants hoping to start careers in industrial safety. They were leaving as proven emergency response professionals who had prevented a potential disaster. Marcus reflected on how Chen's demanding training had prepared them for real-world complexity. The systematic approach, attention to detail, and emphasis on teamwork had made the difference between confusion and effective response. Jake was amazed by his own growth. The confined spacework that had terrified him on day 2 now felt routine. The emergency response that had seemed overwhelming now felt manageable because of thorough preparation. David appreciated how the training had built on his military background while teaching him new skills specific to industrial safety. The combination of individual competence and team coordination had proven crucial in the real emergency.
None of them could have predicted that 4 days of intensive training would lead to participating in actual emergency response that prevented potential casualties.
They had learned that Chen's demanding standards weren't about perfectionism for its own sake, they were about preparing people to save lives when everything went wrong. The revelation of Chen's personal connection to the Louisiana tragedy had helped them understand why she demanded excellence. Her investment in their success wasn't just professional, it was personal redemption for the operators whose inadequate training had cost them their lives. As they prepared for the remaining months of their training program, all 3 trainees had a deeper understanding of what they were working toward. They weren't just learning procedures and safety protocols, they were developing the skills and mindset needed to be guardians of other people's safety in situations where mistakes could be measured in lives lost rather than points deducted. The experience had taught them that real emergency response was about more than technical knowledge. It required the ability to think clearly under pressure, work effectively as part of a team, and make decisions based on incomplete information when time was critical. Most importantly, they had learned that Chen's intensive training program worked. When faced with real-world complexity and pressure, their systematic preparation had enabled them to function as effective professionals rather than overwhelmed beginners. The successful emergency response had validated Chen's approach and honored the memory of the 3 operators whose deaths had motivated her to create the most demanding safety training program in the industry. For the first time in 8 years, she could see that her efforts to prevent future tragedies were producing the kind of safety professionals who could make a difference when it mattered most.